It's quite magnificent. It is such a beautiful thing. In my view, the most beautiful and complicated thing in the world is not in the stars, it's not in the skies, it is inside each of us. It's in our little children, it's in our friends. And we are understanding how the brain works. And we understand, for example, where empathy and insight and emotion and morality and intuition, all these things come from. The red piece in the front of the brain, that is called the prefrontal cortex, PFC. And that's where many of these functions come from. It is the CEO of your brain. It is something you have that our cousins, the apes, don't have, right? It is the CEO. It is the number one important thing. And then behind that are all sorts of other things. You have things like the limbic system, which I'll refer to later on, which tells us about emotions and safety and things like that, the reward system. We're understanding all these things. Why is this happening now? It's happening because of technology, actually. It's happening because we're understanding how to image brains. There's a beautiful history starting with Marcy. Marcy showed that you can determine which part of the brain is active by just measuring the blood flow there. It's hard to measure blood flow, but through a series of discoveries, we found that you can measure blood flow through an MRI because blood, when it carries oxygen, repels a magnetic field. And so with that, you can see which part of the brain is active during which activity. Now, based on all that, honestly, if you had to redesign the classroom today, and of course, WOC is a new university. It's only, a couple of decades old. You were designed in a new way, but traditional universities, including mine, MIT, are based on a very old model. And that old model is 700 years to 1,000 years old. And in that old model, if you look at it, nothing has changed. We're still giving lectures. And if you look at this picture of the University of Bologna from 1308, and you look at this gentleman in the blue robe, he is sleeping like some of my students do when they get bored of my lecture, right? And you can see that these two are talking to each other, and this guy is looking at his Facebook feed. So nothing has changed in 700 years. But what is fundamentally even more worrisome is an assumption about learning. And the assumption is that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And that's a very unfortunate assumption. And the reason that's unfortunate is because the human brain should really be treated as an organism that grows. If you have a puppy, you don't give it food in the beginning of the week and say you're done. You have to give the puppy food when it wants food. You have to give it play when it wants play. But we, in our factory model, have ignored that. And we just declare victory when the professor has given the lecture and walked off. And we don't pay attention to the fact that the student has to take these little tidbits of information and organize them into a treasury that will serve him or her well for life. And if you actually think about it that way, you begin to realize that it's actually more complicated. You see, the way the brain works, you remember I pointed at the forehead and I said that's called the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, right? You can think of that prefrontal cortex as a little cartoon. And the cartoon I use is that of a leprechaun, just because leprechauns are cute, all right? And the leprechaun, what this leprechaun does is every time your eyes and your ears come to knowledge, or if you're visually impaired, your fingers, when you come across a little bit of knowledge, the leprechaun goes and picks up that stuff, has to quickly run back and then recast the information in a way that makes sense to you and then put it away. Now, it turns out that's a very tiring task. And when the leprechaun is doing that, by the way, just to remind you, the leprechaun is the executive function, the CEO. And this action of recasting information is what we variously call consolidation, integration, sense-making, saliency, why is this important, connecting the dots. Now, after about 10 minutes, you know what happens? The leprechaun goes to sleep because he needs a rest. There's only so much he can do. Now, when that going to sleep happens, really what the brain is doing is it's connecting the dot. It's digesting the information. And the technical term for this is it's called mind wandering. Literally, the brain has to wander after 10 minutes. But think about it, every lecture in every classroom today is 45 minutes, 90 minutes, 1 hour. And at 10 minutes, you've lost the students. And that's because of nature. And no amount of shaking your finger at the student is going to change that.